Now, while I don't necessarily need one of these, I definitely want one. And I'm going to tell you all the reasons why as we take a look at this 1994 made in Japan Fender Bass VI. So this thing recently came in for service and needed some TLC after 30 plus years in existence. And boy, do I miss having a Bass VI. The only Bass VI that I've had before this was the Squier Vintage Modified Bass VI, which they released back in the early 2010s. And this thing is definitely a cut above that one. And in fact, even better than the Vintera 260s Bass VI, which Fender recently released, because this just has that attention to detail and fit and finish that Fender Japan is known for. Now, before we get into anything else, let's just quickly go over the specs. These came in a polyurethane finish with an alder body, as well as a maple neck and a rosewood fretboard. It features a 7 1/4 radius as well as vintage size frets on a 30-inch scale neck. Now, as far as the electronics go, it came with 3 single coil pickups, which to your eyes probably look a lot like a Jaguar pickup because they basically are identical to them. These were produced in-house in Fender Japan and weren't the greatest, particularly because they were microphonic and not really well potted, if at all. So these tend to squeal, especially in higher gain settings. Now, the electronics in these weren't the best. They came with the Alpha mini pots for your volume and tone control, as well as your domestically produced on-off switches, of which you have 3 for each pickup, which you can select individually and use in combination with one another, just like on a Jaguar, as well as the bass cut or strangle switch, also like a Jaguar. And in fact, this thing predates the release of the Jaguar by 1 year, with the first model coming out in 1961. Now, I'm not going to give you a detailed history of the Bass VI, as there's so many other awesome videos on YouTube that have already done that, so I definitely recommend you check those out. But it's no wonder to me, after playing through this thing again after so many years of not owning one, that this was the instrument of choice for so many legendary recordings over the years, from the Beatles to The Cure. And I love the fact that it exists in that magical space between a bass and a guitar. You can really get some unique tones out of this that you cannot get out of your standard bass or guitar, particularly when it comes to playing chords in the upper registers of this. It just sounds friggin' amazing. Now, as I'd mentioned before, this is a 30-inch scale neck, and a lot of folks have the misconception that the Bass VI is a baritone guitar, which are typically tuned B to B, whereas this one is actually tuned standard E to E, a whole octave lower than your standard electric guitar. So in case you didn't know, despite the fact that I run totally wired guitars and have a deep love for offset guitars, my main instrument these days in my band Leathered is the bass, and that is my main bass back there, the Fender 50s classic lacquer P bass. And as compared to that, the tones on the Bass VI are definitely very different. It doesn't quite get the same oomph and low end that the P bass or even the jazz bass can get. While the Bass 6 is awesome, it definitely can't replace the P bass for me as far as being a dedicated bass. Another reason why is I play with a typical finger style on the bass, and there just isn't enough room on this because the 6 strings here are basically a 56 millimeter string spacing, so pretty standard for most guitars. It doesn't get quite as wide or thick moving up the neck, unlike on a P or even a jazz bass. There just isn't enough space between strings to naturally and comfortably play the way that I typically do on the bass. So of course, I, like most others who play a Bass 6, will end up playing with a pick, and the tones that you can get on this thing, the low end is just so much more than you can get on a standard electric guitar, being that full octave lower. Now, when you approach the Bass 6 as more of a guitar, I feel like you have to kind of live a little bit further up the neck, as things like your standard open chords, for example, are just going to sound a bit muddy and lose definition. But when you are playing further up the neck, you just get these heavenly, deeper guitar type tones that you're just not going to find on a standard electric guitar. And one of my favorite things about the tones that you can get from the Bass 6 is when you use the bass cut or the Strangle switch, when you pair that with various overdrives or distortions, as well as your fuzz pedals, it cleans it right up and just makes for a much more articulate sound that can help you cut through the mix if you're getting a little bit too much mud without it on. Now, despite having Fender Japan's legendary fit and finish, there are a couple of things that did need to be addressed when this came in for service. The first thing, as I had mentioned at the top, was the pickups. The pickups in these were just really, really noisy and microphonic. So I ended up swapping these out with a set of Bass 6 pickups from our friends Emily and Patrick at EP Customs Pickups. These are actually wax potted and just beautifully crafted and hand wound pickups, and just really, really improve both the tone as well as the noise on this instrument. The other thing that I ended up replacing for my client was the vibrato. This thing arrived to me with the collet actually having completely dropped into the tremolo route because it had just come loose over the years. It's a fairly common issue with 90s Fender Japan tremolos. So we ended up replacing it with an AVRI unit because you just get a much better feeling and more responsive and stable tremolo experience when you swap it out and upgrade to one of these. Now, regardless of the model that you get, there are definitely a number of common pain points to the Bass 6. The first one is that you got to make sure for the string gauge that you are using that the nut slots are wide and deep enough, because otherwise your strings are going to bind at the nut and definitely send you flying out of tune, especially when you use the vibrato. And depending on which model you get, whether it's a Squier or one of the Mexican Bass 6s that have come out, if it doesn't have this wider channel bridge, which is quite a bit wider than your typical offset Mustang bridge or Jazzmaster Jaguar style bridge, then you might not be able to intonate it properly depending on the string gauge that you're using. And if you were looking to upgrade your bridge, you're definitely going to want a bridge that has that wider channel as well. And I recommend a bridge that has 6 individual saddles, because I definitely have heard some accounts from folks who have tried to install a 2 or 3 saddle bridge like the Mastery bridge and not be able to intonate their Bass 6s properly. Now, one of the pain points for the Bass 6 with this wider offset style bridge, particularly on these 90s Japan ones is that these have a bit larger thimble holes for these, and the legs on these bridges are quite narrow, and so there is a lot of play, and it's very, very difficult, even with a good setup, for the bridge to come back to center. So I ended up addressing that by putting surgical tubing on the legs of this to still allow it to rock back and forth, but it comes back to center every time. Now, before buying a Bass 6, I feel like you have to come into it with the expectation that it is going to be a dedicated instrument rather than a replacement for either your bass or guitar, and instead complements both in a really unique and fun way. I mean, where else can you find a bass with a offset style vibrato? In summary, it's very clear that the Bass 6 is very much a niche instrument. And like I said at the top, I don't necessarily need one, but after playing one again, I just am reminded of how fun and unique of an instrument this is. It forces you to play in a different way than you would on a standard bass or a guitar, and you just end up coming up with different kinds of sounds and ideas when you are playing and writing on one of these. So for me, that alone is worth the price of admission, depending on your budget. You can get a Bass 6 for as low as, $300-$400 if you go with one of these Squier Classic Vibes. Those are actually really good. And while those and even the Vintera 260s ones may not have the same level of craftsmanship as these older Fender Japan ones, they're still pretty good Bass 6s. They will give you the same tones, and with some minor upgrades and attention to detail when it comes to the setup, I think that they are perfectly fine. And I think right now I'm going to be on the hunt for probably one of the classic vibe Bass 6s myself, because I just can't justify spending, $2,000-$3,000 on an instrument that is niche, that I'm most likely only going to be playing at home when I'm coming up with song ideas or riff ideas. Anyway, I think that's going to do it for this video. I hope it was both fun and informative of a watch, especially if you are in the market for a Bass 6. What do you all think? Do any of you actually own a Bass 6 or have been thinking about getting one? For those of you that do own them, what are your favorite things about the Bass 6 and how do you use them in your band or project? Definitely let me know down in the comments, as I'd love to hear them. And as always, if you haven't already, please hit that like and subscribe button, as well as the notification bell to be notified of new videos as soon as they drop. And don't forget to follow Totally Wired Guitars for more offset guitars buying tips.